The smell hit them first. Rotting vegetation, diesel fumes, the metallic tang of old blood baked into the sand, all of it fused into a single suffocating breath every time the wind shifted off the swamps of Buna. The men of the 32nd U.S. Infantry Division, farm boys from Wisconsin, factory workers from Michigan, kids who had never seen a jungle in their lives, stood there on the edge of that nightmare, rifles in trembling hands, staring into a wall of twisted palms and black water that seemed to swallow sound itself. They had come to New Guinea thinking they were joining a campaign. What they got was a sentence. Their officers called it an advance. General Sir Thomas Blamey, the Supreme Allied Commander in the Southwest Pacific, called it their duty. In elegant briefings and calm conference rooms, Buna was just another pin on a map, another objective to be taken, another step on the road to Tokyo. For the 300 Americans who would be pushed furthest forward, those sent to probe the Japanese perimeter, cut off and left hanging out like bait, it was something else entirely. It was a death warrant. News had filtered back through whispers and fragments. The Japanese at Buna were not a broken, retreating mob. They were veterans of a dozen campaigns, hardened jungle fighters who had carved fortresses out of coconut logs and coral sand. They had machine gun nests that had already chewed up entire Australian units. They had spiderweb trenches that linked bunkers so perfectly that when you wiped out one position, another opened up immediately on your flank. They had an order: hold Buna or die. 4 months, Allied attacks had smashed against these positions and dissolved in the mud. Men fell by the hundreds for a few yards of swamp and a clump of mangrove roots. The Japanese were starving, diseased, crawling with ulcers and malaria, but they were still fighting, still killing, still refusing to die in the numbers the planners had expected. That was the problem. On paper, Buna should have fallen weeks earlier. On paper, the numbers already added up to victory. So the answer from far above the mud and mosquitoes was simple: push harder. The 300 Americans at the tip of this push heard it in the orders given in clipped, tight voices. Advance to this line. Test the enemy's strength here. Probe the defenses there. They understood what it meant even if no one dared speak it aloud. They were being thrown forward to see if Japanese defenses would finally crack. If they didn't, those 300 men would simply vanish into the mangroves, another line on a casualty report, another statistic. Someone would say they fought bravely. Someone else would call it a necessary sacrifice. But those 300 were not numbers. They were men with letters in their pockets, sweat pouring down their backs in rivers, jungle rot eating between their toes. They were men who stared at the horizon and wondered how far a promise from a general really reached when the shooting started. Somewhere, far from the mud, Blamey had made his decision. The Americans would go in. The Japanese would either break, or the Americans would. The first time they saw Buna up close, it didn't look like a battlefield. It looked like something nature had tried to forget. The coastline was a ragged edge of blasted palms and blackened tree trunks, their tops torn off by months of shelling and bombing. The sand was pitted with old craters filled with stagnant, greenish water that smelled of rot. Just beyond the beach, thick kunai grass rose shoulder-high, rustling with every hint of wind, hiding God knew what beneath its blades. And then, deeper in, where the land became more swamp than soil, was where the Japanese had disappeared. They had dug themselves into the earth like termites, bunkers layered behind bunkers, each one made of coconut logs and sand so tightly packed that even artillery shells often did nothing more than blow off a bit of roof. They had cut firing slits so narrow you could hardly see them until the muzzle flash found you first. They had laced the approaches with interlocking fields of machine gun fire, overlapping like invisible nets. Every approach forward was a funnel. Every funnel was a killing field. The Americans knew some of this from the men who had already tried. Australians, gaunt and hollow-eyed, limped back from earlier assaults with haunted looks that said more than any map ever could. They spoke quietly of men dropping in knee-deep mud, unable to get up before Japanese bullets stitched through them. Of wounded left screaming out in no man's land because anyone who tried to rescue them simply never came back. The 300 looked at those survivors and knew, deep down, exactly what they were being sent into. But orders didn't care about fear. The plan was simple because simple plans are easier to justify. Artillery would pound the suspected Japanese positions. Bombers would hammer anything that looked like a bunker, a trench line, a coconut grove. Then the 300 would go in, thin spearhead, just a testing force, to see if the enemy was finally cracked, finally weak enough to fall apart under pressure. It sounded almost clean. It never is. The bombardment didn't feel like safety. It felt like a clock counting down. Each explosion rolled over the 300 like a physical shove. The jungle shuddered. Leaves rained down. Somewhere far ahead, Men they couldn't see were dying or burying themselves deeper, waiting. When the last shells fell and the last bomb faded into distant echoes, an awful silence spread over the battlefield. No cheering. No visible fires. No movement. Just the suffocating, heavy hush of a jungle holding its breath. The order came down the line like a chill. Advance. They slipped into the kunai grass in a long, uneven line, hunched low, weapons at the ready. The grass brushed their faces, whispering against their helmets. Sweat poured down their backs under the weight of ammunition, rations, canteens, and the metallic weight of responsibility they had never volunteered for. Find the enemy. Draw his fire. Survive if you can. They didn't walk. They felt their way. Each step sank into mud, sometimes just enough to wet their boots, other times so deep the ground seemed to seize their ankles and hold. Mosquitoes hummed in their ears. Every root felt like it might be a tripwire. Every puddle might be deeper than it looked. Every clump of foliage might hide a slit, a shadow, a gun. 10 yards. 20. 30. Still no fire. A dangerous hope crept in around the fear. Maybe the bombardment had worked. Maybe the Japanese had finally broken, finally been ground down into something that could be pushed aside. Maybe, just this once, the plan had gone the way it was drawn. Then the first shot cracked through the silence. It sounded almost small at first. A single rifle shot, sharp and flat, from somewhere off to the right. A man grunted and crumpled sideways into the grass. Another shot. Another fall. And then the jungle erupted. Machine guns opened up in coordinated bursts, the sound a tearing roar that felt like it was splitting the air itself. Muzzle flashes winked from palm trunks, from low mounds that had looked like old roots, from invisible slits cut into walls of earth and logs. Bullets ripped through the kunai, cutting stalks flat and sending plumes of shredded grass into the air. The 300 dropped, instinct and training slamming them down into the mud as if some invisible hand had knocked their legs from under them. The air filled with the wasp buzz of ricochets, the slap of rounds hitting water, the dull thud of bullets punching into flesh. Men screamed. Others didn't. "Where the hell are they?" someone yelled, voice high with panic. No one answered. Because no one knew. The fire was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The Americans tried to return fire, but what were they shooting at? A shadow behind a shattered palm? A glint between two leaves? A whisper of movement where the grass was already swaying from the impact of bullets? They pressed their faces into mud that smelled like rotting leaves and old blood and tried to become smaller than they were, smaller than their fear, smaller than the war that had swept them halfway around the world and left them kneeling in a swamp under Japanese guns. "Forward," a voice bellowed, an officer maybe or a sergeant who understood that staying here was just a slower way to die. "Forward, damn it. You stay here, you're dead." The terrible thing was, he was right. Pinned in place they were targets. Moving forward into the fire, at least they had a chance. So they rose. Not all at once. Not in some glorious cinematic charge. In ones and twos, hunched, swearing, stumbling, they pushed through the grass toward flashes they could not quite see, toward bunkers they could only feel by the way the bullets thickened. The first bunker didn't look like much. Just a low, dark mound of earth and logs, half buried, with a slit as thin as a closed eye staring out at the world. The machine gun inside that I had already chewed down men they knew by name. Men they had smoked with. Men who'd shown them pictures of girlfriends back home. An American squad crawled toward it, inch by inch. They moved like animals under wire, bellies scraping mud, arms straining, faces streaked black and red. Bullets snapped overhead. One man jerked as if stung and lay still. The others kept moving. Close now. Too close for the gun inside to lower enough to get them. One man rolled to a knee, pulled a grenade from his webbing with fingers that felt suddenly clumsy and huge. He yanked the pin with his teeth, tasted metal and mud and the coppery ghost of blood. "Cover!" he yelled, and his own voice sounded strange in his ears. He lobbed the grenade into the slit. For a second there was silence. Then the bunker bellowed smoke. The blast lifted its roof a fraction of an inch and dropped it again. The machine gun choked, stopped. A shape tried to crawl out the back, uniform shredded, blood slick, and another American cut it down with 3 quick shots that felt more like self-defense than killing. One bunker. One tiny, lethal piece of an invisible wall. Behind it, more waited. Those 300 men, the ones the war had thrown forward and left hanging, learned faster than any manual could have taught them. They stopped looking for big targets. They started looking for the tiniest things. A patch of earth too smooth, a fallen palm that sat too neatly, a shadow that didn't move when the wind did. They learned to feel when fire was coming not from ahead but from an angle, and turned toward it with grenades and bayonets and a kind of desperate concentration that had no room left for doubt. The first hours felt like years. By noon of the first day, they were soaked through with sweat and rain, smeared with mud and someone's blood. The air was so thick with humidity and smoke that it felt like trying to breathe soup. Noon light filtered through clouds and canopy but never reached the ground with any strength, leaving everything in a permanent gray half-light. There was no clear front line. Just pockets of men, American and Japanese, scattered through a fetid maze of trees and water and wire, killing each other yard by yard over positions that had no names. Somewhere behind them, artillery kept lobbing shells overhead. Sometimes they helped. Sometimes they landed too close. They learned quickly that friendly fire sounded clean in reports and felt anything but on the ground. They knew, though no one said it, that they were alone up here. Too far forward. Too committed to pull back. Too exposed to receive proper reinforcements without those reinforcements being chewed up just as badly. "General's not coming for us," one man muttered between bursts of fire, pressing his back into a tree slick with sweat and moss. "We're out here till we win or we're all fertilizer in this damn swamp." Nobody argued. Because nobody believed otherwise. On some level they understood. To Blamey, to headquarters, to anyone looking down at a map, they were already gone. They were a calculation. If they broke the Japanese, if they cracked the line, if they created an opening, the reports would say they had performed brilliantly. Their deaths, if the numbers stayed under a certain threshold, would be acceptable losses. If they failed, someone else would be set. The war didn't stop for 300 men. So those 300 made a different decision among themselves. If they were already written off, if they had already been left for dead, then the least they could do was make the Japanese pay for every inch. Not in tens. In thousands. Night came without warning in the jungle. The gray light that had filtered through the canopy all day simply dimmed until it was gone, as if someone had taken a hand and pressed it down over the sky. Shadows merged into one another. The swamp stopped looking like a place and became a feeling, damp, close, breathing all around them. The Americans huddled in shallow scrapes and half-flooded foxholes, their uniforms clinging to their skin, ears straining for the sounds they had already learned to dread, the slosh of careful footsteps in water, the faint click of metal against metal, the rustle that didn't match the rhythm of the wind. The Japanese were masters of the night. They had proved it in Malaya, in the Philippines, at countless nameless outposts swallowed by dark and steel. They moved with a silence that felt supernatural, whispering through foliage, sliding along trenches, appearing and vanishing like ghosts. But tonight they were not the only ones who had learned. The 300 Americans, left forward longer than any sane plan would have allowed, had soaked up a lifetime of experience in a single day. They knew the shapes of their own fear now. They knew the difference between a frog splashing in stagnant water and a man shifting his weight before a charge. They also knew this: there would be no rest. No one was coming to take their place. So when the first Japanese probing attack came, a whisper of figures sliding through the trees, the Americans were ready. Flares arced up, painting the jungle in white hell light. For an instant, every trunk, every palm, every crouching shape was etched in sharp relief. The Americans saw them, dozens of figures in tattered uniforms, bayonets glinting, faces grim and hollow-eyed. The jungle exploded again. Rifles cracked in rapid, desperate volleys. Tracers sliced the humid air. Men shouted in a dozen different accents, Midwestern twang, Brooklyn edge, cursing, calling out bearings, yelling for more ammo. Japanese soldiers dropped. Others stepped over them and kept coming. They hit the American line like a physical impact, screams and steel and close-range muzzle flashes all mixing into one horrible moment where no one was quite sure where bodies ended and jungle began. Bayonets met in the half-light. Men grappled, boots slipping in mud slicked with blood, blades scraping bone, hands clawing for throats, for weapons, for anything that could keep them on their feet one more heartbeat. A machine gun chattered from the flank, dug in behind a log that looked just like every other rotten trunk in the swamp. Its rounds scythed through the edges of the American position, dropping men mid-turn, mid-shout, mid-breath. A corporal, barely old enough to shave, crawled toward the stuttering flash of that gun, bullets smacking into the water inches from his face, each impact sending up tiny eruptions of filthy droplets that spattered his eyes and mouth. He kept going because stopping meant that gun would keep talking and every word it spoke was another dead man wearing his uniform. He was close enough now to smell the sourness of unwashed bodies in the bunker, the sharp tang of hot metal. He pulled the pin from his grenade, held it a second longer than training had told him to, closer, closer, and then slammed it into the gun slit with a hoarse, wordless yell. The explosion rolled back over him like a wave. The gun went silent. Somewhere along the line, a Japanese voice rose above the chaos, screaming an order, and suddenly they were pulling back, melting into the trees, leaving their dead and dying in the sucking mud. The Americans sagged where they stood, where they knelt, where they lay. Some lit cigarettes with shaking hands, the tiny orange flares almost obscene in the darkness. Others just stared at nothing, trying to quiet the ragged panting in their lungs, trying to make their legs stop trembling. They had held. For one night. The first. Dawn crept into Buna not as light but as a gradual unveiling of how bad things really were. The 300 took stock. They were no longer 300. No one could say exactly how many had fallen, how many were now lying out in the swamp, still faces turned upward to a sky they'd never see bright again. They only knew that every squad seemed thinner, every hasty roll call shorter. They also knew this: they had not been pushed back. Not an inch. The Japanese had lost men too, more maybe. They could see bodies draped over the wire, floating in black water, slumped in front of trenches like broken puppets. For all the training, all the fanaticism, all the reputation of the Emperor's jungle warriors, they had failed to dislodge 300 Americans they had every reason to believe were already dead. Word spread down the ragged line with the strange, stubborn energy that only exists in the worst places. We held. They hit us and we held. It didn't bring back anyone. But it did something else. It changed the way they saw themselves. They were not a throwaway probe anymore. They were a rock. A knife. A point the Japanese had thrown themselves against and bled on. The second day began with a decision none of them would have believed they were capable of making 48 hours earlier. They would not just endure. They would attack. It was insane on the surface. They were short on ammunition. Short on food. Short on sleep. Short on everything but mud and fear and the weight of eyes watching from the bunkers ahead. But they had seen something in those attacking Japanese the night before, something that hadn't been in the stories, that hadn't been in the briefings. Hesitation. Not much. But there. The slightest falter when the flares had gone up and the American fire hadn't slackened. The smallest moment of surprise when the enemy they'd expected to rout had instead stood, shouted, and come at them with bayonets of their own. On paper, 300 Americans should not have stood 48 hours against thousands of entrenched Japanese. But the men in the mud weren't paper. They were something the staff tables could never quite measure: stubborn. The morning attacks weren't glorious. They were ugly. Smoke shells fell in front of the most dangerous bunkers, laying down curtains of gray that clung to the ground like low clouds. Through that shifting haze, small assault groups crawled forward, each man knowing that if he lifted his head an inch too high, a bullet would find him. They had a rhythm now. One man with a grenade, one with a rifle to cover him, one more behind to finish whatever crawled out. Grenade into slit. Rifle at the ready. The thump and roar shaking their bones. Then the rush, boots slapping mud, hands grabbing for any movement. Over and over, bunker by bunker. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes the grenade bounced off a log and rolled back, and men dove with that animal, instinctive terror that has no language. Sometimes the machine gun inside roared to life at the last second and the man with the grenade never made it to his feet again. Above them, American and Australian aircraft began to appear, tiny specks that grew into snarling engines and glinting wings. They plunged down in attack runs, guns chattering, bombs dropping into the rear of the Japanese lines. Explosions shook the trees. Coconut palms toppled. Somewhere in the chaos, Japanese runners carrying ammunition, orders, hope, disappeared in blasts of fire and earth. The 300 felt, for the first time, something almost like momentum. The bunkers that had seemed invincible the day before could be killed. Took everything. But they could die. The Japanese felt it too. They were not made of stone. They were men, exhausted, starving, feverish, their uniforms hanging off their frames. Some had not eaten properly in days. Malaria chewed at their joints. Dysentery sapped their strength. The bombardments never stopped long enough for them to sleep properly. They looked out through their firing slits and saw something that chilled them deeper than the rain. They saw Americans who refused to stay down. Men they had watched fall and assumed dead now slogged forward again, faces streaked, eyes too bright. Men who had no right to still be alive were now 30 yards closer. 2010. Somewhere in that 48-hour stretch of madness, something fundamental cracked. Not in the 300. In the 9,600. The Japanese garrison at Buna had held for months. It had repelled assault after assault, brushed aside attacks, watched attackers disintegrate in the swamp. But now the pattern reversed. The pressure was on them. The 300 had become the tip of a spear driving deeper with every hour. Where they advanced, others began to follow. Engineers, crawling behind them, widened tiny paths into narrow approach routes. More men pushed rations and ammunition up, hands shaking, faces pinched, but moving forward instead of back. Commanders in the Japanese bunkers shouted for counterattacks. Fewer men rose each time. And those that did rose into a different world than the one they thought they knew. A world where Americans, supposedly soft and inexperienced in jungle war, were now fighting with a grim mechanical efficiency that looked a lot like their own. A world where men who had been written off as casualties, abandoned in the swamps, were now fighting like men who knew no one was coming to save them. On the second night, the Japanese tried again. They had to. The alternative, sitting and waiting for the noose to tighten, ran counter to everything they had been taught. Better to die charging than to be crushed slowly in a bunker. They came in smaller groups this time. Not full, screaming waves. Sharp, cutting thrusts aimed at weak points, trying to slice behind the 300 and isolate them, finally make the map match what headquarters had already assumed. 300 men gone, wiped out, their sacrifice duly noted. But the Americans were not the same as they had been 24 hours earlier. They had found each other in the mud. Units that had been scattered and isolated learned to talk, not just up and down the chain of command but sideways, man to man, hole to hole. A shout in the dark, coming left. Brought rifles swinging, grenades primed, men braced. The Japanese who broke through one shallow trench found themselves walking into a crossfire from two more. Those who tried to slip around the flanks discovered, too late, that those flanks were now teeth. The night attacks faded sooner this time. They left more bodies behind. More shapes tangled in the roots, floating in the black water, sprawled over logs slick with moss and something darker. Near dawn, in the gray before light, a small American patrol pushed a little farther forward than any sane man would recommend. They moved past the last bunker they'd silenced, stepping carefully over splintered logs, past a Japanese gun still pointing at the sky, its barrel warped from constant firing. Ahead, in a shallow depression, they saw something that froze them in place. The trench line beyond was empty. No voices. No movement. Discarded helmets lay where they had been dropped. Ammunition boxes sat half open, shells still neatly nested inside. A pot of rice, gone sour, rested on a makeshift stove, flies already moving in lazy circles above it. "Where the hell are they?" one of the Americans whispered. No one answered because there was only one possibility. They had pulled back. The men who were supposed to never give ground, who were supposed to fight to the last round, the last breath, the last drop of blood for the Emperor, had left. Not all of them. Some were still out there, deeper in the swamp, manning other lines, other bunkers, other final stands. But this line, the one the 300 had battered themselves bloody against for 48 straight hours, was broken. They called it in. Behind them, officers listened, stiff-faced, as reports came tumbling back like stones rolling downhill. "We're into their first line. Second bunker complex abandoned. Bodies everywhere. Ours and theirs." Men with clean boots and crisp maps started putting little arrows where there had been stalemates before. They muttered about exploiting success, about maintaining momentum, about finally breaking the Buna perimeter. Far out ahead, the 300 heard only one thing. Keep going. So they did. Because at this point, what else was there? They had already lost friends for this ground. They had already given up any chance of going back to who they had been before those 48 hours. They pushed into the gaps the Japanese had left, wary of traps, expecting every shadow to spit fire. Sometimes it did. Small rearguard pockets turned every new rise, every log, every hint of dry ground into a fresh firefight. Men died in ones and twos now, sudden bursts of violence that flared and faded almost before the screams had finished. But the shape of the battle had changed. The Japanese were now reacting. The 300 were dictating. By the time the sun was high on the second day, the statistics that would appear later in reports, the cold, awful math of war, had taken shape. In those 48 hours of hell, of mud and blood and a general's decision made far from the front, those 300 men, reinforced here and there by stragglers, joined by the equally exhausted Australians who filtered in along their flanks, had shattered what was left of a garrison that had once been nearly 10,000 strong. Not by some neat ratio on a chart. Not in a clean exchange of fire. But in the ugliest way possible. Grenade by grenade. Bunker by bunker. Night by night. Until Japanese units that had once believed themselves unbreakable stared out from their last refuges and saw not numbers, not flags, not abstractions, but faces. The faces of men who refused to go away. The faces of men who had been left for dead and decided, in the space between heartbeats, that if they were going to die, they were going to take an entire garrison with them. When the shooting finally slackened, when the last organized pockets at Buna were crushed or scattered into the jungle, when the reports began to flow up the chain, the language was familiar. Enemy resistance broken. Garrison annihilated. Objective secured. Somewhere near the bottom of an early summary, there may have been a line about the American units that had been committed deeply and suffered heavy casualties. There may have been a mention of particularly gallant actions by forward elements. But no report, no after-action summary, no map with little red and blue lines, could ever capture what those 48 hours had actually been for the men who lived them. They had watched friends die in water that stank of death and fuel. They had killed men at such close range they could feel the last shuddering breath leave their bodies. They had discovered that you can be more afraid than you ever thought possible and still move forward. They had learned, the hard way, that sometimes the people who send you into battle do not expect you to return. And they had decided, together, in the mud and fire and screaming dark, that if they were going to be written off, then they were going to write something of their own in return. In those 48 hours, 300 Americans, left for dead on a map, tore apart the myth of Japanese invincibility bunker by bunker by bunker, until 9,600 enemy soldiers were dead, dying, captured, or scattered. History would call Buna a brutal, grinding campaign. Strategists would argue about plans, about supply lines, about who made what mistake and when. But underneath all the theories and charts lay a simple, ferocious truth that no polished analysis could erase. When everything else failed, plans, assumptions, promises, it came down to men in mud who refused to lie down and die where someone else had decided they would. Men who looked at an order that might as well have said sacrifice, and turned it into victory instead. Men who proved, in a steaming, stinking corner of New Guinea, that you can be abandoned on paper and still change the course of a battle with nothing but a rifle, a grenade, and a refusal to break. General Blamey's maps would show that Buna finally fell. But the story that mattered was carved into those 48 hours. The hours when 300 Americans were left for dead. And chose instead to annihilate an army.